want to give Arkansas any kind of good shot at it. They're going to let Arkansas inbounds the ball.
Reed now, 4 seconds, 3 seconds. Reed trying to dribble, 2 seconds, 1 second, long shot. Got it!
What you heard is one of the most celebrated shots in Arkansas basketball history. A last-second, 49-foot shot by U.S. Reed at the buzzer to win a second-round NCAA men's basketball tournament game. It happened on March 14, 1981, in a Midwest regional game against Louisville, the defending NCAA champions. People still hearken back to that shot from 43 years ago. They can refresh their memories any time by watching it on YouTube, where it's been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. Reed regularly appears on commercials in Arkansas for an online sports book, and his shot is referenced in at least one of those ads. 3 buzzer beaters happened that day, a day that is often credited for igniting the country's interest in March Madness before the term was even introduced, at least in a basketball context. But Reed's half-court heave is not the most famous buzzer-beating shot in Arkansas history. Not after this one, which occurred 13 years later.
Beck looking inside, nothing there. Spits it out to McDaniel. Exactly 1 minute to play.
Shot clock to 10.
Beck to the baseline, spits it out to Stewart. Right side, Thurman. He's open for 3. Good! Scotty Thurman with his third 3. Arkansas leads it by 3 with 48 seconds to go.
That shot, made by Scotty Thurman, which beat the shot clock buzzer with less than a minute to go in the final game of the 1994 NCAA tournament, was the go-ahead shot that gave Arkansas basketball its first and only national championship. To have the fullest understanding of how the 1993-94 Arkansas Razorbacks men's basketball team won its title, one needs to go back to what the program was like during the 1970s and 1980s, and the transition it underwent following a pivotal coaching change. By the spring of 1985, the Razorbacks basketball program had not made it to top echelon status alongside the likes of UCLA, Indiana, Kentucky, or North Carolina, but it was well within sight of it. For the preceding decade, the Razorbacks were very much in the national spotlight, courtesy of a future Hall of Fame coach who, to the shock and dismay of Hogs fans, announced in April of that year that he was leaving to take another job, and he would leave a lasting impression at his next stop, just not the kind anyone expected. In the meantime, the man hired to replace that future Hall of Fame coach was insistent on doing things his way. But would it be the right way? Many would raise that question, and it would linger for a little while, but not for long. The Arkansas Razorbacks men's basketball program turned 100 years old last year. While it enjoyed occasional success during the 1940s, it had not earned sustained national fame until the arrival of Eddie Sutton. In 1974, Sutton was hired following a 5-year stint in Creighton, where he had taken the program to a 23-7 record and a berth in the NCAA tournament. The Blue Jays finished the 73-74 season ranked 14th in the nation. The job Sutton did at the small Catholic university in Omaha, Nebraska, caught the attention of at least a couple of big university athletic directors that year, including one in Durham, North Carolina. The Duke Blue Devils were on the hunt for a coach to succeed the departing Bucky Waters, who had struggled to succeed legendary coach Vic Bubas. Meanwhile, Frank Broyles, the athletic director at the University of Arkansas, wanted to make a big splash with his next coaching hire. If he had any hope of beating out Duke for the chance to sign Eddie Sutton, he had to fly through inclement weather to do so. Bob Holt, no relation to your host, is a longtime sports writer for the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette. He said that Broyles was prepared to do all he could and sell as hard as he could to lure Sutton to Fayetteville.
He wanted Arkansas fans to have stuff to root for other than football. He made a big pitch to Eddie Sutton. He drove through a snowstorm to get to the Final Four. I think it was in Greensboro. It was the year that NC State knocked off UCLA and then beat Marquette. And Duke was trying to hire Eddie Sutton at the time. I mean, Eddie Sutton had done great at Creighton, and, he had options. And he said a lot of coaches like Dean Smith and Bobby Knight told him, don't go to Arkansas. It's a career killer. They're not serious about basketball, but Arkansas was fixing to get serious about basketball. And, Eddie Sutton proved to be the right guy at the right time for them.
It should be noted the irony that Broyles wanted Arkansas athletics to be bigger than its football team. He was not only the university's AD at the time, he was its football coach, the same coach who led the Razorbacks to the national title in 1964 and nearly a second one in 1969. Broyles would retire from coaching after the 1976 season, but would stay on as AD for another 30 years. Broyles had as much flair running an athletic department as he did a football team. He was persuasive, and he knew it, and he laid it on thick for Sutton. Coupled with the charismatic pull he got from Broyles, Sutton apparently was drawn to the challenge of building a basketball program at a football school in a football state. He ignored the warnings from the likes of Dean Smith and Bob Knight, and he took the job. He had a lot of work to do. David Alfin is a retired realtor. An El Dorado native, he now enjoys retired life in Fayetteville and is an alumnus of the University of Arkansas. A serious fan of its basketball program, Alfin is a fixture inside Bud Walton Arena. He's attended mostly every home game for the past 45 years and remembers going to games at the old Barnhill Fieldhouse while a student prior to Sutton's arrival.
And I remember one time we all kind of slid down to the other end of the bleachers, and I got a splinter in my rear, and I said, good grief. I said, what is this? Where'd they get these things? As it turned out, it was a little set of bleachers in the south end zone in the football stadium, and Coach Broyles moved it back inside so they could get another year out of it before they rotted. So there wasn't much money back then like there is now.
The Fieldhouse literally had sawdust on the floor beneath the bleachers. Alfin told me that during home basketball games, he could hear the football team have spring practice behind those same bleachers. While watching a basketball game, spectators could hear the assistant football coaches screaming obscenities to the football players. Wally Hall, who then was a Cub reporter for the Arkansas Democrat, remembers what those games were like, and he remembers that the football players did their part to urge the basketball program to get better.
They would go to basketball games, and sometimes they were the loudest ones there. They started supporting it. They kind of helped it become established when they were called the Mad Hatters. They would all wear wild hats, these football players would. But basketball was, I don't know if it's ever been on a level playing field with football, but, that's the Southwest Conference and Southeastern Conference. Football's the king. It's the moneymaker.
For Sutton, the grass did wind up being greener in Fayetteville compared to Omaha, and Barnhill Fieldhouse would be converted to Barnhill Arena. No more sawdust and rotted bleachers. Arkansas basketball became a major draw under Sutton's watch. While coaching the Razorbacks, Sutton never had a season in which his team finished worse than 8 games above 500. In addition to U.S. Reed, Sutton recruited, signed, and coached the likes of Sidney Moncrief, Darrell Walker, and Joe Klein, just to name a few. At that time, Arkansas was in the Southwest Conference, and Sutton's teams dominated conference play. During the 1976-77 season, Sutton's third in Arkansas, the Razorbacks went 16-0 against conference opponents and finished the season with an overall record of 26-2, but lost in the first round of the NCAA tournament to Wake Forest, foreshadowing a trend that an ACC team would be Arkansas's last opponent of the season. But Sutton was just getting started. The following year, he and the Razorbacks had their best season to date. In March 1978, the Razorbacks won their conference championship, finished the season 32-4, and made it all the way to the NCAA tournament's Final Four, losing to the eventual champion, the Kentucky Wildcats. Back then, the two teams that lost in the semifinals played each other for third place, and Arkansas won that consolation game against Notre Dame, 71-69. The following year, Indiana State defeated Arkansas in the Midwest Regional Final by the score of 73-71. The Razorbacks were one possession away from possibly preventing the dream matchup between Larry Bird's Indiana State team and Irvin Magic Johnson's Michigan State team, which set up one of the greatest individual sports rivalries of the 20th century. It was estimated that 40 million people watched that championship game, making it the highest-rated basketball game, college or pro, in American television history. Being a major team in that tournament further raised Arkansas's basketball profile and Eddie Sutton's profile. Sutton remained with Arkansas for 6 more seasons, earning more conference crowns. Tough to do considering how great the Houston Cougars teams were during the early 1980s. In all, the Razorbacks made the NCAA tournament 9 times during Sutton's last 9 years in Fayetteville. Sutton had lifted the program to prominence by the time Alexander Wolf joined Sports Illustrated as a college basketball writer.
Arkansas was in the national conversation as a basketball program by the end of the 70s. So when ESPN comes along and college basketball kind of blows up and the UCLA dynasty is clearly over and there's Big Monday, all that stuff, Arkansas is primed to be part of the conversation, and that's pretty exciting. So if you're in the state, if you're in Fayetteville or Little Rock, you've got a year-round sports diet now. It's not just football.
During his time in Arkansas, Sutton's teams won more than 73% of their games, which included a staggering 137-35 record in conference play. After all that success, Sutton announced following the 84-85 season that he would be leaving Arkansas for another coaching job, possibly the most coveted job of all in college basketball, the head coach at the University of Kentucky. Wally Hall, who by then was a columnist and sports editor for the Arkansas Democrat, wrote in his April 3, 1985 column after the announcement was made that Sutton would be leaving the largest university in the natural state for the largest university in the bluegrass state, that Kentucky was, quote, the only program in America bigger than this one in Arkansas, end quote. Sutton made at least a couple of comments at his press conference that he would soon regret. David Alfin still remembers one comment in particular that Sutton made, one that revealed how much he wanted to leave Fayetteville for Lexington.
I remember on TV, he said I would have crawled all the way to Kentucky to get this job. And I thought, oh, gosh, don't say that.
Wally Hall remembers it too, and he remembers the fans' reaction to it.
They started out being sad, and they got mad real fast. Eddie, when he left and said I would have crawled to Kentucky, it angered the basketball fans.
Wally did not write any blistering words about Sutton's resignation. He encouraged fans to look on with optimism. He assured readers that athletic director Frank Broyles would choose the right replacement. He wrote, quote, after all, wasn't he the man who chose Sutton, end quote. Wally ended that column writing, quote, Eddie Sutton took basketball out of the closet and into your heart. May the new coach build from that, end quote. The list of candidates to replace Sutton that was published in the Arkansas Democrat the day after the news broke of Sutton's resignation was a dream list. It included Gary Williams, who would later win a national title at Maryland, Bobby Crimmins, who went on to win 579 career games, mostly at Georgia Tech, where he won 3 ACC tournament titles and earned a Final Four berth, Gene Cady, a former assistant under Sutton in Fayetteville, who had gone on to coach the Purdue Boilermakers, eventually becoming the winningest coach in school history, and Gene Bartow, who succeeded legendary John Wooden at UCLA and later launched the athletic program at the University of Alabama Birmingham, where he coached the men's basketball team to 6 straight NCAA tournament appearances, including an Elite Eight appearance, a tremendous finish for a team from the Sun Belt Conference. Most of the men I just mentioned have basketball courts named after them. Other candidates mentioned in the ensuing days as possible candidates for Arkansas included Raleigh Massimino, who had just won a national title with Villanova. It was later learned that Massimino actually got an offer from Arkansas and successfully leveraged that offer to get a raise at Villanova. Another marquee name was mentioned by the local media as a possible candidate, Duke Blue Devils coach Mike Krzyzewski. Coach K still had not made his first Final Four, but that was around the corner, and news broke around the same time that he had just earned a commitment from future All-American and Naismith College Player of the Year winner, Danny Ferry, who later helped Duke reach 3 Final Fours. So Krzyzewski wasn't any more likely to go to Fayetteville than his mentor, Bob Knight, who, by the way, was also rumored to be someone Broyles wanted to hire. During those 10 days of waiting on who the hire would be, Wally Hall was working around the clock trying to get the jump on the news. He worked in Little Rock, but spent so much time in Fayetteville that he needed to find places that he could turn into makeshift workstations.
Well, I spent the whole week up there. I had several, this was before cell phones, so I had several payphones staked out, and there was a restaurant. It's not there anymore. And I went there so much, they had a blackboard where they would put the specials of the day. But when I started towards the end of the week, when I'd go in there, they said, Wally, call so-and-so, because they were looking for me at that restaurant.
In the end, it was another high-profile candidate who landed the job, one from a university less than 2 hours west of Fayetteville. A coach who brought a high-octane brand of basketball that intimidated opponents and eventually turned an already vigorous fan base into a euphoric one. On April 9th, 1985, Nolan Richardson, previously the head coach of the Tulsa Golden Hurricane for 5 seasons, was introduced as the 10th ever coach of the Arkansas Razorbacks men's basketball team. Richardson became the first black head coach ever hired at Arkansas, and the first black head coach ever hired by any Southwest Conference school. It was reported that at no other time had any black man been hired to coach a major Division I basketball team in the old Confederate South. Considering that Arkansas is where the Central High School integration controversy took place 28 years earlier, that fact was not something to take lightly. There were no questions about whether Richardson was qualified to be the men's basketball coach at the University of Arkansas. His 5 seasons at Tulsa were 5 of the 6 most successful seasons in school history. Before he coached at Tulsa, the program had only been to the NCAA tournament 1 time. Richardson took them there a total of 3 times. In the 2 other seasons he coached there, he led them to the National Invitational Tournament, known as the NIT. And during his first year at Tulsa, Richardson led his team to the NIT Championship. That came in 1981, when far fewer teams were selected for the NCAA tournament, so an NIT title was harder to win and mattered more. On top of everything, before he was hired at Tulsa, Richardson had coached for 3 seasons at Western Texas Junior College. In his 3rd season, his team went undefeated and won a junior college national championship. As Bob Holt remembers it, Frank Broyles first learned about Richardson years earlier during a fundraising trip to Oklahoma. The trip took place during the NIT tournament that Tulsa won.
All due respect, the NIT was a lot bigger deal back in 1981 than it is now. And so Tulsa was playing Syracuse, and Frank Broyles said he's over there speaking, and then afterward he's kind of hobnobbing with people. And a bunch of people are held around TV watching Tulsa. And so he goes there to find what's going on. Why are all these Razorback fans watching Tulsa? And then, he started finding out more about Nolan Richardson. And then he thought Nolan would be a great hire at Arkansas, that he was coaching an exciting brand of basketball the fans would enjoy, and he could recruit, and he won at a high level.
So when Sutton vacated the job, Broyles instantly thought of Richardson. And Richardson wanted to add an NCAA Division I championship to his already sterling resume. Richardson told me that lofty goal was firmly in his mind from the outset.
Tulsa University is no question one of the finer jobs, but my goal was to get a chance of being able to get a place that could eventually win you a national championship.
As it turned out, Nolan Richardson was reluctant at first to leave Tulsa for Arkansas. That hesitation was not because of the state's history on race, or his impression of Broyles, or whether he thought he could win a title in Fayetteville. Nolan Richardson's 13-year-old daughter, Yvonne, had been diagnosed that year with an aggressive form of leukemia. Richardson did not want to take Yvonne away from her medical team in Tulsa. So when Broyles first reached out to him and asked whether he would be willing to sit down for an interview, Richardson declined. According to the book 40 Minutes of Hell, The Extraordinary Life of Nolan Richardson, It was actually Yvonne who convinced her father to change his mind. In his interview with me, Richardson confirmed that was true and recited a story. Yvonne had once accompanied her dad to Fayetteville for a Tulsa, Arkansas football game and was astonished at how rabid the Razorbacks fan base was. She heard the fans in a packed stadium calling the Hogs. It went something like this. Hearing and seeing that mesmerized Yvonne. She wanted her dad to coach at a place like that. Yvonne always thought that a greater home court advantage would give her dad's teams a better chance to win a national title. She urged her father to consider Arkansas, so he did. He called Broyles, notifying him of his change of heart, and the two eventually sat down for an interview. By the end of it, the search was over. Shortly after it was announced by Broyles that Richardson was the next men's head basketball coach, and about an hour before he was introduced to the media, Richardson held a closed-door meeting with the Razorback players. No one else was allowed in that room, not even Broyles. Richardson immediately won over his new squad. Nearly all of the players came out of that meeting excited not only about their new leader, but the fact that they were no longer going to play a hold the ball and savor every possession style of basketball. As Alexander Wolf remembers, that was the Sutton way of doing things.
Well, certainly as a fan, I remember in the 70s when Eddie Sutton got there, he was a disciple of Henry Iba. Henry Iba believed in ball control and defense. Every possession was sacred. Maybe that's what made Frank Broyles like his philosophy, because it's very much a football coach's way of approaching basketball.
Nolan Richardson was more of an indirect disciple of Hank Iba. He played under legendary coach Don Haskins at Texas Western College, now the University of Texas El Paso, and Haskins learned under Iba. But Richardson's style was much different compared to Sutton's. Under the new coach's leadership, Arkansas was going to play an up-tempo game, the kind of style that most college basketball players love to play. It was assumed that this squad was no different. It probably was not a case of the players not wanting to play a more intense style of basketball. They just weren't as adept at doing so. The team's overall athleticism was not to the level Richardson had hoped for. As Wally Hall put it, the cupboard was kind of bare when Sutton left.
Eddie, his last year, he had 2 first-round draft picks. Joe Klein and Alvin Robertson were both first-round draft picks, and there was nobody to replace them. Nolan took over a team that played half-court offense and would pass the ball. There was no shot clock. They would pass the ball 15, 20 times before somebody take a shot, and Nolan came in with a different style, but it didn't fit.
The Razorback style of play under Richardson would eventually be monikered 40 Minutes of Hell. Ironically, Richardson's style of play was more hellacious for his own players. It was not ideal for them. That soon became obvious to Bob Holt, in spite of the words of positivity coming out of Richardson's mouth.
I think he wanted to build up the players, so he spoke very positively about them. Now, privately, maybe he was thinking, I don't know about this, but publicly, he was very, he talked up the players a lot. And I think he was doing that to build up their confidence, and he wanted to be optimistic. But ultimately and realistically, there were guys that fit his style.
The 1985-86 team finished with an overall record of 12-18, including a meager 4-12 in Southwest Conference play. The season ended with a first-round defeat to Texas A&M in the Southwest Conference tournament. There would be no postseason berth, and for the first and only time in Richardson's career as a college coach, he finished below 500 at the end of a full season. Richardson once said, looking back on that first season at Fayetteville, quote, "You have to sweep the house out before you move in. I didn't do that at Arkansas, and that may have been a mistake." End quote. The conference tournament was played in Dallas, and more than 3,500 Razorback fans filled the arena to cheer on their team, even though the season was a disappointing one. The sea of red inside that arena astonished the opposing coach, who basically said that if every team had the fan support that Arkansas had, it would have made for a better tournament. There may have been loud support inside that arena in Dallas, but outside the arena, there was a lot of talking going on, second-guessing about whether Richardson was the right guy for the job. David Alphen heard some of that talk from fans.
They were used to a very disciplined type of basketball with Eddie Sutton. Coach Richardson was just the opposite of that. The old saying back then was they would describe it as run, shoot, and holler. There's no discipline with them. It's just a different brand of basketball.
The honeymoon phase for Richardson was over by the time conference play began that first season, and that's when the losses started piling up. All that anticipation, not to mention a top 20 preseason ranking, was a distant memory. It wasn't merely a down year for the Razorbacks. It was a down year for the Southwest Conference, which went 0-16 against teams ranked in the top 20 that season. It seemed to many at that moment that if Arkansas was unable to finish even in the middle of the pack in a below-par year for the Southwest, then the future did not look bright for Richardson and Fayetteville. Richardson's inspiration during that trying year was his teenage daughter, Yvonne, a girl who had moved away from all of her closest friends to a new house in a faraway college town, all while dealing with a deadly disease. She never complained. She was never bitter. She kept the faith, and she made sure her father didn't lose his. It was during the middle of the 1986-87 season, her father's second season in Fayetteville, that Yvonne lost her battle with leukemia. She was 15 years old.
I think you learn a lot about who I am and what my family and what my kid meant to me. You don't see those things when you're trying to work and coach and get a better job and have a chance to win basketball games. But to go through the situation that me and my wife, actually my sisters and the players that were left over had to go through, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. That's horrible.
Today, Richardson's home is in northwest Arkansas. He reached college basketball's highest peak while coaching the Razorbacks. He still speaks glowingly of his time at the university. But he told me that if he could go back to 1985, even knowing then what he knows now, he isn't sure he would make the same choices.
It was a very tough decision for me because I was worried and concerned about us not having the proper medical care in Fayetteville. But it turned out to be something that if I had to do over again, I don't think I would, because that was the hardest 2 years probably my entire life in anything that I had done.
Wally Hall and others had to write about a man suffering the most devastating loss any father could suffer while watching him pour every bit of energy he had left into his team, a team that looked better than the prior year, but still was not quite to the level that Razorback fans wanted.
Obviously, Nolan was burdened. I mean, he was losing his baby girl, and it weighed heavily on him. And honestly, I don't think it took away from his job. I think he buried himself in the job to get relief. But yeah, it was a tough time.
Richardson's team was 8-4 by mid-January and had faced a tough out-of-conference schedule, including a game against the Kansas Jayhawks, led by junior forward Danny Manning. That Kansas team was coached by Larry Brown, and his staff included first-year assistant Greg Popovich, who'd later lead the San Antonio Spurs to 5 NBA titles. Arkansas won that game against Kansas, 103-86. But the rest of the season came with a number of frustrating losses. They finished in the middle of the pack in the conference, and again lost in the first round of the Southwest Conference tournament. They earned a bid to the NIT, something that Broyles downplayed in the media. He openly referred to the NIT as a loser's tournament, something Richardson hated to hear because he was proud of the NIT he'd won in Tulsa. There were a lot of things that Broyles said during the season that Richardson did not like. There was a lot of friction between the two men by that time. But the Razorbacks had an extended postseason, which it had not had since before Eddie Sutton left. It nearly ended in disaster in the opening round, when the Razorbacks hosted Arkansas State. Richardson still remembers.
Many people would say that might have been Nolan Richardson's last basketball game at the University of Arkansas. And 17 years later, 16 years later, I'm still there.
The University of Arkansas losing a win-or-go-home game to the smaller Cross-State University would have been a crushing blow, one that some have speculated might have led to Richardson's ouster. The coach himself told me that the rumor mill was spinning fast in the days leading to the start of the tournament. He told me where there's smoke, there's fire. But someone stepped up before the game and put out the fire. It was University Chancellor Daniel Ferreter, who assured Richardson that win or lose, he would remain the coach of the Razorbacks. That put the coach's mind at ease. But those who watched that game could feel the tension, especially when Arkansas State jumped out to a 21-point lead. The Razorbacks pulled off the comeback and beat Arkansas State, but they followed that with a second-round defeat to Nebraska. The 86-87 season was not a losing season, but it was a ho-hum season, not the kind of season that Broyles wanted, Richardson wanted, or the Razorback faithful wanted. But that would be the last, below-expectation season the program would have for a long time. Nolan Richardson was a changed man afterward. Following those first couple of years in Arkansas, Richardson became more empathetic, but also a more demanding coach, which may seem like something of a contradiction. In the book, 40 Minutes of Hell, author Russ Bradford described Richardson this way. He had a heightened understanding and sensitivity for other people's pain, and that's because of what his daughter lived through. At the same time, he saw the unwavering courage that Yvonne showed while battling cancer, so he had zero patience for players who struggled to fight through their own adversities, which by comparison always seemed far less severe than Yvonne's. As I mentioned, the coach had a strained relationship with his boss at the time. Broyles wanted Richardson to preach more discipline and be more like Bob Knight. Richardson bristled any time Broyles spoke to him that way. Richardson was about to prove to Broyles how grateful he needed to be to have a forward-thinking coach over a throwback firebrand. For starters, Richardson knew that one major change was coming to college basketball.
Everybody had learned their basketball from Eddie Sutton, so basketball was supposed to be half court. Passed it 30 times. No one knew the shot clock was coming. There was a handful of coaches that knew it had to come. It was in the NBA. If it happens in the NBA, it's going to happen in college. And he brought a different style in, and when he got his players in, buddy, it was fun.
Nolan Richardson needed not only skilled players, but the kinds of players that could handle a tough loss, or a tongue-lashing, or a vomit-inducing practice, and bounce back from it, and be better for it. And he'd find fertile recruiting ground by heading east on Interstate 40, just over the Mississippi River. Memphis was the place that had those kinds of kids, highly skilled players who wanted to be coached hard. The first player Richardson recruited from Memphis was Ron Hury, who was Tennessee's High School Player of the Year. Then in 1988, Richardson recruited Todd Day, who also was the state's top player. Day would become Arkansas's all-time leading scorer. Richardson almost made it 3 in a row when he narrowly missed out on Penny Hardaway, who decided in the end to remain close to home and play for Memphis State. But the pipeline from Memphis to Fayetteville was open and flowing for years.
You know, Memphis was a place where they supported 3 schools. University of Memphis had Memphis players, UAB, and Arkansas. That's 3 teams. I bet you there's got to be 12 players, 12, 13, 14 players right from there playing on different schools. It became not too far from us, about a 5-hour drive. And so I made that kind of my base.
During year 3 under Richardson, the Razorbacks finished the season with a 21-9 overall record and an 11-5 conference record. It was the kind of upward trajectory that Richardson wanted and needed, but his team lost in the first round of the NCAA tournament to Massimino's Villanova Wildcats, so Richardson was still looking for his first NCAA tournament victory. He was 0-4 in his career in the Big Dance, and he knew he needed to break that losing streak. That was the offseason in which 3 future NBA players were signed: Todd Day, Lee Mayberry, and Oliver Miller. Mayberry was recruited from Tulsa, and he had led his high school team to a state championship. Oliver, a highly touted athlete in his own right, was recruited out of Fort Worth, Texas. That trio made up the nucleus that turned the Arkansas program from a mid-seed tournament team into a national powerhouse. Arkansas finished the 1988-89 season with a 25-7 overall record and a 13-3 conference record. Richardson got his first NCAA tournament win by defeating Loyola Marymount in the first round, a 5-seed. The Razorbacks lost in the second round to Purvis Ellison and the Louisville Cardinals. Everything was set up for a deep tournament run the following year. The 1989-90 team was as good as advertised, finishing the season 30-5. It was only the second time the Razorbacks ever won 30 or more games in a season. The only other team to do that was Eddie Sutton's Final Four team 11 years earlier. Richardson guided his team to a 14-2 record in the conference, as well as a Southwest Conference Tournament Championship, his first. The Razorbacks were ranked as high as number 3 in the country that season and made a lot of noise in the NCAA tournament, winning close games against Princeton and Dayton in the first 2 rounds before crushing North Carolina in the Sweet 16 and then beating Texas in the Midwest Regional Final, a 4-seed. A bit low considering Arkansas's resume that year, the Razorbacks were about to play in only the second Final Four in school history. The team that Arkansas would face in the national semifinal was none other than the Duke Blue Devils, a 3-seed out of the East. Duke won 87-73. 2 nights later, Duke went on to get shellacked by the UNLV Runnin' Rebels in the most lopsided championship game loss in history. UNLV won 103-73. The following year, Arkansas was Sports Illustrated's pick as the number 1 team, not UNLV in spite of the Runnin' Rebels having all of their top players coming back from their championship team. For SI, it was the returning backcourt of Day and Mayberry that got the writers there excited. Arkansas hosted a home game against the Runnin' Rebels that year and lost 112-105. But it still felt very possible that the 2 schools were on a collision course for the national championship. UNLV actually went undefeated all the way to the Final Four, but it was Duke that upset the heavily favored UNLV team. The Blue Devils would go on to win the national title, while Arkansas lost in the Elite Eight to Kansas. That Jayhawks team was the squad that Duke defeated in the title game to win its first championship. Arkansas, which tallied 34 wins that season, a school record, solidified its standing as a team with national title hopes year after year.
There were 2 years in a row where he won more than 30 games. Those were the Mayday years, and Oliver Miller. I mean, he had players from Memphis, Oklahoma, Texas. He was spreading out. His reputation was growing, and he was able to bring kids in that wanted to play that style because that's the way the NBA played. Why not play an NBA style of basketball?
In the midst of all that, a major shift was happening in the conference landscape. More specifically, the conference that Arkansas had been a member of since 1915, the Southwest Conference, was imploding, and Arkansas, the only non-Texas team in that conference, saw what was coming and split for the Southeastern Conference. The Southwest Conference would dissolve 4 years later. Beginning in 1991, Arkansas's first in the SEC, the regular season would be much more challenging for the Razorbacks. Year after year, they would face a tougher in-conference schedule. In his first season in the SEC, Richardson led his team to a 13-3 conference record and a 3-seed entering the NCAA tournament. Unfortunately for the Razorbacks, they were upset in the second round to Memphis State, led by none other than sophomore guard sensation Penny Hardaway. That surprising defeat ended the Day, Mayberry, and Miller era. All 3 players would later be drafted in the first round of the NBA. Razorback fans still looked forward to the seasons ahead. That's because a new class was coming in, one led by a chiseled power forward out of Russellville, Arkansas, and a savvy shooting guard out of Ruston, Louisiana. Corliss Williamson and Scotty Thurman were coming, and the fever pitch in Fayetteville for men's college basketball was about to reach unforeseen levels of intensity. And that hog call that Yvonne loves so much was about to get really loud.
Hog Wild, the Razorbacks championship season, is a podcast by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette. The show is written and hosted by Tony Holt and produced by Kyle McDaniel.